Hi guys, welcome back to Beginning Python Lesson 4. So today we're going to be covering lists. Today we're going to be covering lists. We're using lists with the loops we learned about last week, and we're going to be learning about more methods just to work with lists. So some quick review. If you don't know the answer to any of these, you might want to look it up or go back to our previous lessons. So what does 7 is greater than 2 or 19 minus 3 is less than 1 and 50 is greater than 32 return? So remember, or means one of these has to be true, and means both of these two statements have to be true. So what is the difference between equals equals and single equals? And is this an infinite loop? So a equals 5, while a is greater than 5, a equals a plus 1. And if it is an infinite loop, what would you do to avoid it, or how would you change it to be an infinite loop if it isn't? So, do any of you guys know what a list is? If you are, this part might be a bit easier for you. But basically, a list is a type of variable that is a box for other variables. So just like a variable can store a single piece of information, a list can store a bunch of variables. So we use these square brackets here to create a list. And basically, just like a normal variable, we initialize it with name equals, and then we have bracket, and then you write out each variable you want to keep track of, and then you put a comma here to separate them. So comma space, and then so these are strings, so it'll be quotes, and then these are numbers, 3 comma 1 comma. These are booleans, and these are you can actually do a mix of all three. So a list can actually contain any type of variable, and it's not just one type per list either. You can have all three. So if you want to find the length of the list, you can use len, animals. So len and then in parentheses the name of the list you want. And so in this example, animals here, there's 4 indexes, so it'll print 4. When we edit a list, a confusing thing here is that we start counting from 0. It's called 0 indexed, which means the first piece of information is not index 1, it's index 0. So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, and since there's 4, every list actually counts to 1 extra, so it's up to 4 but not including 4. So from 0 up to 4 but not including 4. So that's how we get the length to be equal to the amount of things. So it doesn't actually print this number, it prints up to but not equal 4. So if we printed animals and then in square brackets 0, this basically, this small piece of code accesses the thing at that index. So here, index 0 is snake, so this gives us the string snake. So if we print that, it'll just say snake. So when we access a list, the thing we get is a variable, so we could also, just like a regular variable, change it to something else. So in this case, we're accessing the thing at index 0 equals and then fish. So we're just changing it to from snake to fish at index 0. And once we print that, instead of snake, turtle, cat, dog, it'll be fish, turtle, cat, dog. So a quick quiz, just make sure you know how to do these things. What is a list? What do we use it for? How do you want to get the thing at index 0 if we want to access that variable? And if you wanted to change that element to be goat, the string, how would you do that? So if you don't know any of these, yeah, just look it up or go over my explanation again. So here is a program that uses loops to print each animal individually. So here before, it prints them out all at once formatted like a list, but this one will just print them out in a line like this. So we have our original list with snake instead of fish, and then we have a counter called index equals 0. And while index is less than the length of animals, so this, remember, returns 4 because it's up to but not including 4, even though it counts to 3 here. And then we print whatever is at the current index, so animals and then index, because that's going to be either 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then we increment the index by 1. So that's basically the same as moving to the next element in the list. And what our print is, or our terminal is going to end up being is just going to be snake, turtle, cat, dog, because we're printing and then going to the next one and then printing again. So I want you guys to think about at every point in the loop, what are the values of index going to be? What is it going to count up to? And why does the code not create an index equal to the length? So why do we count to 3 or why do we count to 4 even though there's 4 things here? So basically, why is it 0 indexed? And if it did make an index equal to the length, what would happen? So if we did 3. So some quick answers. It would be 0, 1, 2, 3. The last index is always 1 less because it's up to but not including 4. And because if it's less than length of animals, animals is 4 long, so when index is 4, it'll just break out of the loop. And what would happen if we did make it equal to 4, then it would get an error because we're trying to access something at index 4, but it doesn't go up to index 4. It goes up to index 3 and then has not up to but not including 4. And a sum activity, so having this list of animals, we're going to create a loop that finds the sum of every single element. So we're going to start out with a sum variable that's going to be what you're adding to. So like this original example, instead of print animals index, we're going to do something to this sum variable that's a string variable that's going to eventually contain every animal variable. And whenever the element is even, if you want to do a challenge, whenever the element is even, add it to the sum, and if it's odd, subtract it from the sum. So instead of a string list, we're going to have a integer list. So if the list was 2, 1, 5, 9, in the original example, you would eventually get 2 plus 1 plus 5 plus 9, which is 17. But in this challenge, it's only if it's even. So it would be 2, which is even. So we'd start out 2, odd, so we subtract, and end up with 1. 5 is also odd, so we'd have negative 4. And then 9 is also odd, so we'd end up with negative 13. So yeah, you can pause and go over that, and then it should take a few minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, so hopefully you got that. The answer should look a little something like this. So this is, your code shouldn't be this long because this is the regular challenge and the, this is the challenge answer and the regular answer. So we have sum equals 0 because we need to add the numbers to somewhere to be able to keep track of them. Index equals 0, that's our counter in the loop. And while, just like before, while index is less than length of the index, then it's going to run the loop. So we have sum equals sum plus list. Sorry, anywhere it says index in this first one, it should say list. So index equals index plus 1 is correct, but list index and length index is incorrect. It should just be length list here, not length index. So we add whatever's at the current index, so list index, to the sum, and then we increment the index by 1. So we start looking at the next number. And then eventually we print the sum, so here that's 17. And in the challenge, it's basically the same, but here, if list index is divisible by 2, so if it equals 0, then we add it, else, so if it is equal, it won't trigger this. If it isn't, it will. Sum equals sum, and then we subtract whatever's at the index. And just like in the example before, we got negative 13. And index equals index is the same here, because we still want to move through the list regardless of whether it's even or odd. Okay, so a quick check-in. You should be able to explain the code like I did for the previous activity. And if you wanted to change the first element of the list, it doesn't have to be the list in that one, but any list, if you want to change it to monkey, how would you do that? In fact, you could also write some code to do that real quick. And what does len list do? What does it give you? So now we're going to cover some methods to go with list. So something like len is one of them. But we have 4 methods here. So list append, list pop, list insert, and list remove. These all have different parameters that they want. So we'll start with the first one. So append will add whatever variable you give it to the end of the list. So you can't really pick where it goes. It just throws it on the end. And x here is going to be the variable you want to add. But in pop, list.pop, it removes whatever you have at the index. So instead of giving it a variable, it will get rid of whatever variable is at the current index. So if I want to remove snake in our example list, I would say list.pop 0, and it'll remove the first thing in the list. List insert actually needs 2 variables now. We need both the index and the variable. So this is kind of like a more advanced version of append, where it'll add the variable at the index you give it. And list remove just takes a variable, and this is kind of like list append, but the opposite, where it'll just remove the first time it sees that variable from the list. So in an example, if you had a variable that's just 5, or if you had a list that's just 5, 5, 5, 5, and you do list remove x, and where x is 5, then it'll only remove the first 5. So yeah, if you ever have any multiples, remember that it'll only remove the first one. So here's a quick example. Our original list is equal to 1, comma 2, comma 3. List append 4 will add 4 on the end. List pop 0 will just remove 1 because that's at index 0. List insert 2 comma 5 will insert variable 5 at index 2. So this is a little confusing because it's not inserting directly here. It's inserting basically in between 1 and 2, and 2 will become 3 and 3 will become 4 and so on. So what that becomes is 5 at index 2 and 4 at index 3. So this diagram might be a little confusing, but think of it as inserting and you become the new index and everything else gets pushed back 1. So you should be able to remember the 4 main methods and what they do and when you're supposed to use them. It might be difficult to remember, so you could write it in your notes or just keep going over that section of the video at about 11 minutes. Okay, so some quick review. What's the difference between pop and remove? When would you want to use one over the other? And if you want to add the number 10 in our list to index 3, what function would you use? And what would number list look like at the end of this code? So if we append 10, append 20, append 30, what would 1, 2, 3 look like? So you can pause and go over those for a minute. Okay, so some answers. Pop removes by the index and remove removes by the element. So what that means is pop will remove anything that is at the index you tell it, whereas remove will remove the element at any index no matter where it is, as long as it exists in the list and there's not more than one. If you wanted to insert the number 10, you would just do dot insert 3 comma 10. Remember, the first variable is the index, the second variable is the actual number you want to add or a variable you want to add, and the number would be 1 comma 3 comma 10 comma 20 comma 30, because append basically just throws it on the end, it just sticks it on. So if we stick those 3 on in a row, you would have 10, 20, 30. So now we're going to be having sequences. So our goal here is actually to make a list of numbers from 1 to 10, 100, sorry. And most of the time we start out with a list, but this time making a list is our goal. And you theoretically could make a list manually just by typing square bracket 1 comma 2 comma 3 comma all the way to 100, but that's a waste of your time and we don't want to do it that way when there's a more efficient way. So we're actually going to start with an empty list, so just list equals and then brackets, and then have a counter that is equal to 1. And then we're going to use while loops where we increase the counter by 1 and append it. Remember, we should append because we want it to count from 1 to 100, so it should just add the new number onto the end. And you also want to be stopping when the counter is over 100. So now, yeah, you can work on that, or the two challenges. Instead of adding 1 to the counter, try dividing it by 2, and you should also watch out for an infinite loop. Challenge 2, using the sum loop we made before, using the sum of the second list we generate. What do you notice? So basically take the take the while loop that adds up the sum of an entire list and do it once you've created that list from 1 to 100, and what do you notice about the number? So you guys can pause and take a few minutes. Okay, so hopefully you went over that. This is the answer key. So we have counter equals 1 and an empty list, and while counter is less than or equal to 100, we append counter, and counter plus equals 1. So you might be confused by what plus equals means, but it's just a simpler or quicker way to say counter equals counter plus 1 because it's a little clunky to say that every time. So it's just a better way. And then if we print it, we'll have this output, so 1 comma 2 comma 3 all the way to 100. And the reason we print out 100 is because it does less than or equal to 100. So when it's equal to 100, it'll run the loop one more time, print it out, and then at 101 it'll just break out of the loop. And then for the challenge, we have actually two variables that we're modifying, so counter and toAppend, and that's because we're dividing the number we're adding by 2 each time, but we still want to increment the counter by 1, and we don't want that to get messed up. So it looks pretty similar, but we have list.append toAppend, so you're not appending the counter anymore, you're appending this specific variable we set aside, and then divide that by 2 and increment the counter by 1. Because if we added whatever we're dividing by 2, then you would increment by 1/2, which is not possible. You can't. There's not a half index. and then if you print that out, you'll get the answer. And then for our second one, index equals 0, sum equals 0, and then while the blah 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 index is less than the length of the list, you add your list index to the sum. And if you print that out, you'll get something like this. And interestingly, even though this looks really confusing, you get like e minus 29, it actually equals to 2. So now we're going to be working on the number guessing game. So you should have a list called guessed numbers, and every time they guess a number in your loop, you should add that number to the list. And eventually, if once they lose or win, you can say, okay, you won or lost, here's every guess you made. And then you could just have a while loop print out every list. Alright, so hopefully you can take the time to add that. If you're confused about anything, you could go to office hours. And yeah, so you should be able to add that to your project.